Welcome, everyone. Really glad to welcome you here to our session on the called the En-ROADS workshop. This is a hands-on simulation where we'll get into some of the nitty-gritty of trying to solve the climate crisis with different levers of change. I'm really excited to have Katherine Markova presenting for us today with Climate Interactive. I'll also say I've seen this En-ROADS simulation a number of times with different faculty, and I learn something new every time. So I think that you'll find it to be an incredibly powerful tool. Even if you have seen it in another setting or at your school, there's a lot of different ways to look at this from different industry lenses, different time lenses, different stakeholder lenses. And I think that you'll find it to be just a really terrific exercise. We are hoping for this session to be interactive. So if you are willing to put your camera on and use the reaction button to raise your hand if you have questions or want to contribute as we go, that would be terrific. We will also be reading the chat and the Q&A, but this is a session where we want to invite you to actually raise your hand and we'll call on you and you can come off mute and contribute. Know that we are recording, so if you do, you'll be part of the recording as well. Before we get in, many of you participating in our workshop have heard a lot about ClimateCAP already, but I want to highlight a couple of resources that are on our website that you may not have found yet. So first of all, we have a resources page. If you go to climatecap.org, you can find the tab for resources. We have recordings of what we call our MBA Academy series available, and these are terrific webinars that we have done covering all kinds of topics from the MBA founder's journey to the role of the CFO in accelerating sustainable business to using your MBA to get the climate career you want. So there's lots of great content there. We invite you to watch that at your leisure. We also include timely articles, podcast recordings, and events in our newsletter every month that are tailored to our MBAs. So we know you'll be getting that in your inbox, but we hope that you'll actually take the time to scroll down and click through some of those links. If you did not already previously attend, we hosted a session in May called Integrating Climate into Your MBA. Definitely check out that recording if you haven't already seen it, because you will hear advice from 12 different business educators in different MBA programs about their recommendations for the ways that you can build skills and climate expertise during your MBA to prepare yourself for a business career that contributes to climate solutions. And the last I'll mention is there's also a recording on MBA careers and climate that I gave as part of Terra.do's Climate Career Week earlier this year. So hopefully you'll find something that's valuable to you and will continue to be a resource throughout your MBA journey. Thank you again to our sponsors, Deriva, Apex, and Environ. And with that, let's jump in. I'm going to turn it over to Katherine, who is the Partnerships Manager for Climate Interactive.
Thank you very much, Katie. Thank you for the introduction and for having me today. Thank you all for joining the session. As Katie said, this session will be really highly interactive, so be prepared to roll up your sleeves and work together. And with that, I've just shared in the chat a link to our polling software. If you could navigate your way over there, I'll also share my screen in a moment, and you'll be able to just scan the QR code with your phone if you prefer to do that. So there's the QR code. I'm going to activate this poll. So I work for an organization called Climate Interactive. All of our experiences are highly interactive. So I have a question for you. I'd like you to think about, based on everything you've seen and heard and all interactions you've had so far with businesses and everything you've seen in the business press, which impacts of climate change are of most concern to businesses today? And if you're using two or more words, so for example, wildfire risk, just hyphenate those two words and create a word cloud for us. So navigate your way to this software. The link is in the chat. There you go. I can see some responses coming in, or you can scan this QR code with your phone. Keep the browser window open because I have 3 more polls for you. All right, great. Well, let's go and check it out. Okay, supply chain disruption. That's right. Business continuity, water. That's a big one. The model that we will be using today, En-ROADS, is a climate model. One thing we don't have is water, but absolutely, particularly with AI and data centers, the question of water conservation, reuse, scarcity is a big topic of discussion. Disruption, energy infrastructure, energy costs, yes, indeed. Microplastics, physical risks, damage, yes, economic damage, climate change. We're losing a big proportion of our global GDP to climate change already, with insurance gap, with just increasing costs of energy, supply chains. So I'm looking at these responses, and I think it would be useful, you may have already come across these concepts, to bucket them into three different categories. One is physical risks, and we have 6 physical risks we can explore in the model. We have transition risks, so risks associated with transition to a clean economy. And also we have systemic risks. So for example, loss of GDP and wider economic damage, that falls within the category of economic damage caused by climate change. All right, that's great. Thank you. That got us going. Go and introduce you to En-ROADS. So what is En-ROADS? En-ROADS is an integrated assessment model. You may have heard of these integrated assessment models. That's what scientists use when they write reports that get submitted to the IPCC, and when policymakers go negotiate at COPs. Everyone uses some version of an integrated assessment model. So we've built our own, but we've simplified it somewhat. There's nothing simple about it, but we've simplified it somewhat. And the product of that runs really fast. So if I move a slider, immediate feedback you see. So it runs really, really fast. It is freely available. It runs in a browser, and it's also available in 24 languages as well. And what we use En-ROADS for is a number of things. One is to help people understand the current trajectory. So what you're looking at right now on the control panel is our baseline. Okay, so what is a baseline? It's the state of the world that takes into account all policies already in place. So all, when I say policies, I also mean investments in research and development, renewable energy adoption rate. This is actually one of the great news stories here in the renewable primary energy demand. So essentially production of renewable energy, or production of energy from renewable sources continues to increase. So that's obviously good news. So it's conditions that exist today, policies, solutions, investments, adoption rates. And then purely for the purposes of experimentation and simulation, we assume that the global community takes no further action on climate between now and the end of the century. And what does that mean? That means that we're headed towards 3.3 degrees of warming in Celsius, or 6 degrees in Fahrenheit, by the end of the century, right? Now, obviously, we all know where we need to be. We need to be under 2 degrees of warming and as close as possible to 1 zone. So this is not to say that this future will happen, right? I'm convinced that we can still avoid the worst impacts. You're all here. Record of number of people are moving into climate work. I was one of them. I used to be a consultant, nothing to do with climate. I used to advise corporations on taxation. So I think there are a lot of good news stories to celebrate, and the trajectory, for example, again, for adoption of renewable energy is very good. So this is one potential future. Now, this future is in many ways terrible, and we can look at some of the impacts that are associated with it. But today, we will choose not to accept this future and build a different one, okay? And so we have all these different solutions that are available to us. And today, we will simulate as many as we have time for. We won't be able to look at everything. But in a moment, I'll ask you what you'd like to test, and we can go and test that. So once again, what do we use En-ROADS for? Understanding the causes of the climate crisis, the impacts, right? And we just talked about in the business context, we talked about transition risks, physical risks, systemic risks, and then explore the landscape of different solutions. And again, we bucket them into supply, demand, and then other solutions. All right. So in terms of the major drivers, why do we have these escalating impacts of the climate crisis? I'd like you to think at a really, really, really macro level. what's actually happening in the world? What are the major drivers? And think really, really macro, not just we eat meat or we burn coal for energy. And this is a really good framework just for thinking about the climate crisis and also how to explain it to people that are possibly new to this topic. Global population continues to grow, right? We're now a happy family of about 2026 of 8 billion people. We're going to be at about 10 billion by about 2080s. And then actually population starts decreasing again. So the growth is slowing down towards the end of the century. So more people. The other thing that's happening is GDP per capita is growing. Now, that's good news and bad news, right? So incomes are growing. We're lifting people out of poverty in low and middle income economies. People are able to buy their first homes and their child's at school. So that's obviously good news. But also the flip side of that is we have overconsumption in the global north, right? And so actually one of the byproducts of this, when incomes grow, we know that people add more meat to their diet. And that is one of the drivers of deforestation. So you see how we're thinking in systems here, right? So this model is based on system dynamics principles, so systems thinking. All right, so these people, the number of whom is increasing, obviously takes energy to produce this additional GDP. Now, this is, again, another bit of good news to be celebrated. Energy intensity of GDP is falling. So that means we need less and less energy for each unit of economic output. Some of it is to do with the fact that actually increasingly we derive more and more of our incomes from services and particularly financial industry in the US. About a quarter of our economy is financial services and real estate transactions. So we need less and less energy per unit of GDP. And then finally, this energy that these people are consuming has carbon intensity, right? So that's a mix of fossil fuels and renewables on the grid. And again, the news, as we introduce more renewable energy on global grids, carbon intensity is falling. Take all of these four together, and the product of growing population with growing incomes, taking energy that has carbon intensity is CO2 emissions from energy, which is gray wedge over here. So that's one of the bigger drivers. The reason why I'm showing you this, you'll say, well, I know this, Katherine, there's nothing new for me here. Actually, this is not it's not as well known as you think. You know, I've led many of these workshops, and you know, occasionally somebody will say, well, I thought that the biggest driver of climate change is animal agriculture. Or some people say, well, actually, no, it's not a product of wildfires. You know, we have horrendous wildfires right now in Canada, and some say, isn't that so? Yes, these are all contributors, but let's just keep our money on the goal here. The main goal is to reduce our reliance on fossil fuels. This is the main driver. Yes, of course, we have land use, so deforestation mainly. We have methane from different sources. We have fertilizer use is also causing emissions. F-gases, it's things like leaking refrigerators. So we have multiple sources, but primarily, let's just be clear on that. It's mainly burning fossil fuels to produce energy that's the problem. Okay, so that's the causes, the impacts, right? I said we're about 100 and, well, I didn't say that. We have about 190 different impacts of climate change. And you talked about supply chain disruptions, for example. And I'll show you, you know, I was at an event at New York Climate Week a few years, speaker from a consumer manufacturing company, a diversified entity, and one of the things they produce is toothpaste. And it turns out that there's one state in India, in Uttar Pradesh, that's where most of our mint that goes into our toothpaste is grown. And so whenever there's extreme heat or drought or wildfire in Uttar Pradesh, that causes a global, well, prices to spike, but also can cause shortages. And so this is the sort of thing with En-ROADS as well, is we can, so for example, a key location around the world, let's go to Spain as an example, and can zero in on a particular location and look at how different impacts are changing by decade, in terms of days of extreme heat. So this is where we're going from up to 30 days to up to 3 months, and then up to 6 months. So you can see how these impacts are changing. Systemic risks. So we mentioned the fact that we call this the economic damage function, that unfortunately climate change is already costing us a lot of money. So for anyone who's making this economic argument that it's too expensive for us to transition to cleaner economy, well, we can show how many trillions of dollars we're already losing due to climate change because of this reduced business confidence and all the reduction in investments that a business are making, and also costs of dealing with extreme weather events. Okay, so there's about 180 different impacts. You can look at financials, you can look at emissions, you can look at land and forestry. So there's a lot of interesting, if you were to do a deeper dive into En-ROADS, there's a lot for you to look at. However, the focus of today is not accepting this future of 3.3 degrees of warming and building our own scenario, okay, of what alternative version of the future may look like. And actually, this is what businesses are increasingly being asked to do. Almost, this changes somewhat because some countries introduce rules, some countries we're seeing a rollback of rules. But a couple of years ago, we were in the position whereby countries accounting for about half of the global GDP were introducing disclosure rules. And what I mean by that is businesses would have to disclose their physical risks that they're exposed to, supply chain risks, transition risks, and also conduct this thing called scenario analysis. And this means that businesses have to look at the range of future scenarios and essentially describe how their business model and business strategy is resilient to those possible futures. And En-ROADS is one of the tools that can be used to build a tailored scenario, testing your mental models around what do we think is going to happen to adoption of electric vehicles? What do we think is going to happen to population growth? How much of people's diets will be derived from animal products, etc. So in En-ROADS, we can model different policies and solutions. And what you see on the left-hand side is energy supply. So where we get our energy from. Now, again, this is a global picture. It's a global simulator. It's a global picture. But this is actually quite intentional because I think we need to be thinking about all these issues globally. Right now, with the conflict in the Middle East, we're seeing how oil and the changing price of oil, first of all, what a global commodity oil is, but also how that's distorting energy prices elsewhere. So we invite decision makers to think about these issues globally. Food is another good example of a highly integrated global system. So you may hear from time to time in the papers something like, oh, we've reached peak coal. So we've reached peak production of energy from coal. Actually, coal is alive and well. It even expands towards the end of the century. It's cheap and plentiful in places like India and Indonesia. There's a little dip in the middle of the century. Then we have oil. Oil actually shrinks towards the end of the century. It's the most expensive fossil. We have gas, also, alive and well without any additional policies. What we have been really good at and continue to be good at is deploying more renewable energy. So this is where we get our energy from for our businesses, for our households: coal, oil, gas, renewables, big and increasing part of the mix, a little bit of bioenergy that's burning organic waste or wood feedstocks to produce energy. And then we have a small slice of nuclear. Again, this is different in places like France, where it's a big part of the mix. Okay, so on the left, we have different solutions in connection with energy supply, where we get our energy from. So we can phase out coal, oil, and gas. We can do this through this mechanism called carbon pricing, so putting a tax on pollution. We can invent new types of energy like nuclear fusion. We'll see what that does. Then we have traditional nuclear, and then we have renewables plus storage. By the way, there's a lot more detail under the hood. Like there's 6 different ways that we can phase out coal, equitably phase out coal. We're not going to go into that detail, but so you know. In the middle, we have different solutions and policy. And again, when I say policy, this could be a corporate policy as well around use of energy. So electrification of transport, buildings and industry, energy efficiency of transport and energy efficiency, population growth, economic growth. Okay, I'm sure you've heard of the concept of degrowth, circular economy. So all of these different interventions. And then finally, on the right-hand side, we have a suite of different technologies and policies around nature-based solutions, so planting trees, technological carbon dioxide removal, that's direct air capture, agricultural emissions, making agriculture more sustainable. So many different ways we can do that. And then reducing waste and leakage in pipelines, in the amount of stuff that we put on landfills, and then finally prevention of deforestation. So these are your options. To have more niche technologies like carbon capture and storage and green hydrogen. Not going to go into the details of those. So I don't want to second guess. What would you like to test? What are you curious about? What is top of mind? What do you think could move the needle on us as a global community reducing emissions? What are your top 1, 2, or 3 solutions for mitigating the impacts of the climate crisis? So again, you can scan this QR code or click on that link. It's still in the chat. So I'll give you a moment. Yep, we've got one response. Okay. I'd love to see one response from each person, and then we'll see. We'll go with quorum. We'll go with. And by the way, when we ask this question, we get as many answers as the people in the room. Everyone, we all have our own different mental models as to what's going to move the needle. Even with policymakers that have been working on climate policy for years, I still hear, oh, it's all about nuclear. We just need more nuclear. Oh, it's all about tree planting. We just need more tree planting. Also, by the way, one thing I will say, right now, we're just looking at this through the lens of by how much can we reduce the temperature, right? 3.3 degrees is unacceptable. There are multiple co-benefits of certain strategies, even if they don't deliver huge climate benefits. There are co-benefits, but also on the flip side, there are environmental justice considerations as well. There are some policies that are really effective, but if they're hitting the lowest income communities in terms of higher energy prices, that is, an unacceptable policy response or corporate response. Okay, I've got 42 responses. Amazing. All right. So, wow. Okay, brilliant. So we have ag emissions. Ag emissions. Okay, we have planting trees. All right. Nuclear. Nuclear was the #1 solution to be tested in En-ROADS last year based on my own experience. I think it's down to AI and particularly Microsoft renewing or signing a contract to restart a major nuclear plant in the US, but could be. All right, we've got renewables, we've got coal. All right. I would say nature-based solutions for tree planting is in the lead. We've got population and we have carbon pricing. All right. We're not going to get to all of these, but the good news is the model is freely available online, so you can go and test these to your heart's content after the session. Great. Thank you. Engaging. That's fantastic. All right. Let's go and plant some trees. And I'm actually going to let's pick something. Let's look at something other than energy. Let's look at, say, wildfire risk. And then let's look at, this is the one that keeps me up at night, guys. I will open this one. Really concerned about biodiversity loss. This is species losing more than 50% of climatic range, which means the species need to choose different migration routes, and it's a potentially stepping stone towards extinction. Obviously, a lot of the sectors of the economy rely on this, like agriculture, heavily reliant on this. 24% of mammals, that's a really high number. And by the way, humans are mammals as well. So let's just maybe look at these impacts and seeing how much better we can do. Another thing we can actually look at is air pollution. Air pollution is an interesting gauge because, well, you'll see why. All right, so let's say these are the 2 metrics we're trying to optimize for, in addition to obviously reducing temperature. Okay, I'm going to move the slider all the way to the right. That means the only thing that all the governments in the world and all of the businesses And typically how businesses plant trees these days is through the carbon markets, so voluntary carbon markets, so carbon credits, carbon offsets. Many companies buy carbon offsets for forestry projects, very common. So let's just assume the only thing that businesses do is continue to plant trees, individuals plant trees as well. We do nothing else, okay? I'm going to do my next poll. I'm going to ask you to make a prediction as to by how much do you think we can help the planet by adopting this strategy alone, right? Again, alone. We haven't done anything else. We're just going to be planting trees. Do you think we can reduce 3.3? We can reduce it by 0.5, 0.2, 1. So 0.1. So starting with 0.1, so really modest improvement, all the way to say 1 degree, which is like getting us kind of close to the top band in that Goldilocks zone of 1.5 to 2. Let's see. 0.1. Okay. All right. 0.2. So you see, again, we have between us, we have a broad range of opinions, and that's fine. And that's exactly why we've developed this model to give us some clarity. Okay. So we have a pretty broad range of opinions here. But I would say most of you think that it's a moderate climate solution, right? Okay, so I'm going to move the slider all the way to the right. Let's see what's going to happen. 0.1. So most of you are right. Now, why do we think that's the case? By the way, there's a journalist, she's now at New York Times. She used to be at Washington Post. And she rapidly used En-ROADS to fact check a legislative proposal by a member of Congress several years ago. And she said, US planting 1 trillion trees is not a big climate solution. Why is that the case? This is actually a really good time to show you our assumptions. And this is where we get into the nitty gritty. This is, if you were to work as a policy analyst, this is where you'd go deep. What did I say at the very beginning? We have major trends. We have population that's growing, so we need to set aside more land for agriculture. Incomes are growing, and we know one of the byproducts is that people tend to add more meat to their diets. We need to set aside more land for animal agriculture, and also need to grow more crops to feed to animals, right? So the takeaway here is we have all these different demands for land. So we have a limited amount of land available for afforestation and reforestation. Afforestation is essentially planting trees where there wasn't previously tree cover, and reforestation is reforesting where there was forests that were cut down primarily for animal agriculture, for mining, for other uses. But you can, if you have a more bullish assumption, perhaps you've done some research and you think, actually, I think my estimate is it's great. You can check that assumption, right? And by the way, this is all the literature review we've done on this topic to save you time so you don't have to. Now, by the way, one of the ways that the bioenergy industry can go as well is many policymakers are really keen on bioenergy. And even one of the pathways that the aviation industry is thinking about decarbonizing, there are 3 different pathways. Electrification of aircraft, that's only suitable for smaller aircraft. Then you have hydrogen, very expensive, nascent technology. And then the third one is bioenergy, essentially growing trees to burn to create fuel, aviation fuel, which is going to be terrible, by the way. But if that happens, we have even more demands on our land. So there's a lot more to say on this, but I'll just say tree planting is an amazing climate solution, particularly in cities. Who doesn't love trees? Lots of benefits for biodiversity and soil health and air quality, and so it's fantastic. Problem is that we have a limited amount of land available, and therefore we're limited. Saying that, this is also another message here is actually every fraction of a degree matters. Even this relatively modest climate benefit, as you can see, we're already helping 2% of insects, which is, given the billions of insects over the planet and how many species we have, it's already helping. So every fraction of a degree matters. Climate change is going to be a binary, whether solve it or it's all going to be doom and gloom. So every fraction of a degree matters. It'll take many seeds to plant this garden. Okay. Same goes for agricultural emissions, by the way. Agricultural emissions is, and there are multiple different interventions here: food waste, food from animals, different livestock interventions, like different cattle feeds and cover crops for agriculture, etc. So there's multiple interventions. It helps 0.2 of a degree, right? And it also helps with methane. Methane is a big problem, and methane doesn't really, there's not much attention, there's not as much attention being paid to methane as carbon dioxide. Where does methane come from? From leakage in pipelines, from agriculture, and from waste. So agricultural emissions are a big problem. So these interventions help sooner because methane has such high global warming potential. But again, let's remember those global trends with growing population. Agriculture itself is growing. We have actually a lot of graphs that we can show that the amount of agricultural land is expanding quite dramatically. But what is also helping is we're becoming more and more efficient at growing food, so crop yields are increasing. So the two meet somewhere in the middle. So agriculture, important sector. It doesn't quite get us all the way there. Again, remember that breakout of where emissions come from. The gray wedge, burning of fossil fuels for energy. So agriculture, important partner in this, not the biggest one. All right. What else did you want to test? Nuclear. I remember there was a lot of pins dropped in nuclear. All right, let's go back to this graph that we were looking at earlier at, nope, energy. All right, so we haven't done anything to the energy mix, by the way. We've just planted some trees. We've made agriculture a little bit more sustainable through different methods. Now let's go and test nuclear. And here, I'm actually going to show this. This is a graph that shows marginal cost of electricity production from different sources. So I'm sure you know this, but wind and solar, and to some extent, other types of renewable energy, but primarily solar, has been such a success story in terms of the more that we deploy, the lower the cost, the more we deploy, the lower the cost. So it's a nice positive reinforcement. So wind and solar, in terms of cost, or we measure it in cents per kilowatt hour, dropping, overtaking other forms of energy, becoming the cheapest source of electricity. Now, differentiate between electricity and energy, but cheapest source of electricity, for sure, and continues to become cheaper. Contrasted with something like nuclear. Now, nuclear is a very mature technology. It's been around for many, many decades. And yet, as you can see, we've tapped out all the additional, like in terms of learning and economies of scale. We've pretty much exhausted all of them. So the cost is stable. It's high and it's stable. And we're not really realizing any additional saving from it. Now, also, look at something like oil. It's becoming more and more expensive every decade. Again, we've already exhausted all easily accessible reserves. So, there's a lot of conversation around Venezuelan oil and how expensive it is to extract and refine. So you can contrast those two pathways, wind and solar and oil. Okay. So nuclear. And again, in the model, what this means is that we're simulating the impact of all the governments in the world, all of the large institutional investors, essentially subsidizing nuclear. By the way, nuclear is already subsidized by 30% of cost. So this is us introducing an even higher level of subsidy, government or institutional investor pouring more money into it. Let's see what that gets us. We're 3 degrees. I want to ask you to make a prediction as to what's going to happen. Okay. All right, I'm going to move the slide again. 2.9. All right. I bet some of you are disappointed thinking, why did not make more of a difference? Now, one thing to bear in mind is, of course, nuclear is a low carbon energy source. So it's good. So we get some benefit from it. But look at what happens when we subsidize or otherwise encourage growth of nuclear. So this wedge, the baby blue wedge, it grows. What happens to renewable energy? Let's just watch what happens to renewable energy and other energy sources. You can see it squeezes out gas, right? You can see that, dark blue, squeezes out coal, and then squeezes out renewables. Does anything happen to oil? No, right? So again, in the spirit of being good systems thinkers, this is a good example of capital trade-offs. And there's a real example of this. There are some investment funds that were set up by very rich individuals whose name I won't mention. There are investment funds that are pouring more and more money into nuclear and particularly newer forms of nuclear. That means there's less capital available for renewable energy. All types of energy compete with all types of energy unless they're non-substitutable. And I'll give an example in a moment. So yes, we get some benefit from nuclear being a low-cost energy source, but we lose some of that benefit because we've just defunded renewables, essentially. The other interesting dynamic is you could see nothing happened with oil. And that is because we use, and this, by the way, the same applies to renewables. If I were to move the renewable slide, exactly the same thing would happen. And that's because this may be completely obvious to you. It's not obvious to many people we talk to, is that we use nuclear and renewable energy sources to produce what? Electricity. What do we use oil for? 99% of oil is used as fuel. It's very, very small percentage of oil that's actually used to produce electricity, right? So the takeaway here is that renewables, nuclear, fusion, these energy sources are used to produce electricity, which is not a substitute for oil, which is mainly used for feedstock, right? For fuel in cars, non-electric cars, in ICE vehicles, right? In aviation fuel, in shipping, etc. So therefore, subsidizing nuclear, same goes for renewables, is helping, but it's not helping as much because we have this issue with oil as well. Now, with renewables, it's actually good news as well. And I mentioned this before. The forecast for renewables is already so good. We've just looked at the financial side of the equation, right? The forecast is already so good that the model tells us that providing an additional subsidy is not going to move the needle as much because, that ship is sailed. Now, of course, this graph doesn't look as favorable everywhere. This is actually mainly a product of China, some states in the US, like California and Texas. If you're a small project in Africa looking to raise funding, it probably doesn't look as favorable. But overall, the forecast for renewable energy is so good. That's why it doesn't make more of a difference. It does help, but it doesn't help more. So it's kind of, in a way, kind of good news. Now, then you'll say, okay, well, Katherine, surely if deploying more renewables, more nuclear, more fusion doesn't help because we have this problem with oil, then we should take action on oil, right? So let's discourage use of oil. We're back to the same issue in that, I'm going to, I guess, restate this, but as you can see on the left graph, gas takes over and coal takes over, compensates, right? So the challenge we have, again, is taking action on one type of fossil fuel is not efficient because then other types of fossil fuels take over, right? To the extent that they're substitutable. So a more effective way of equitably phasing out fossil fuels is through a carbon pricing mechanism. And I'll leave this one to the end because I want to test this as the very last solution. Okay. One thing that gets overlooked, both in policymaking space and also in corporate space, is the subject of energy efficiency and the demand side of the equation. Okay. So there's a lot of talk about supply, like more renewable energy, more nuclear, less fossil fuels, right? When I look at this graph, there's one problem here, is that all that we've been doing so far is just adding more of each type of energy source. Right? And when I worked as a climate consultant for companies, they would come to us and say, please, can you help us buy renewable energy for our factory in location X? And we would say, have you looked at your energy efficiency? Because that's the first thing you need to do. We need to reduce your energy use as much as possible. And then with the remaining load, it's the industry term, right? Then we'll go and we'll find the right instrument for you to buy that renewable energy, being actually buying renewable energy or buying some form of an instrument that gives you a claim to say that you are buying. So my biggest takeaway from running the multiple workshops last year is that the subject of energy efficiency, so using less, essentially bending the curve on this graph, gets overlooked. And it's immensely, immensely important. So energy efficiency, buildings and industry and transport. So we start with 2.8. It gives us another 0.3 of a degree. So, which so far of everything we've looked at is the most effective. So this is not as exciting, I guess, as sponsoring a bill on a new technology that sounds really promising, like carbon capture and storage, green hydrogen, right? It gets overlooked because this is, I'm sorry to say, boring energy efficiency in buildings. Like, who can be excited about it? But it's actually a very, very impactful solution that gets overlooked. So this, the overall, the amount of energy we produce needs to be reducing. We actually don't need renewables for renewables' sake. We need renewables to be effectively continuing to compete with fossil fuels and displace them, which is not happening right now without additional policies to supply side. But another thing we need to be doing is actually investing in energy efficiency so we don't have to produce as much energy of any kind, fossil fuel or renewables. Okay, so that's takeaway number 5 or 6. I don't know if you've intention. All right. Other thing you wanted to test is population growth. And this may, I'm going to move the slide a little, and this may look a little bit counterintuitive because didn't I just say that one of the major drivers of climate crisis is the population growth, right? Now, one thing we need to bear in mind is where population is growing, right? Yes, we have population growth and we have a lot of associated deforestation as a result. But actually, in countries where people consume a lot, where people consume those products that require a lot of energy, like the US and EU and even China, population is starting to decline. Population is not growing as fast or even declining. Where it's growing in other developing countries where people consume, they have like the lowest carbon, like lifestyles that have the least amount of carbon intensity, right? So that's why family planning, it has a lot of, again, co-benefits, but it doesn't make more of a difference for that reason. Now, when it comes to economic growth, however, the consumption side of the equation, the model is very sensitive to that. So high economic growth and low economic growth, the model is really sensitive to that. Okay, so we're at 2.4. I've left the best for last. We're going to open for some questions soon, but so let me just also just check that I haven't overlooked anything major here. Nothing changed. Yeah, okay. Yeah, I think we're good. I think we covered most of it. Oh, but by the way, also kind of goes without saying that we also, for renewables to be a to electrify everything. Now, you see, I'm sliders and nothing seems to be happening. And that's because the order in which we simulate these policies intervention makes a difference. At this point, we already largely decarbonized the grid and improved energy efficiency. That's why these electrification sliders don't make more of a difference. So the order in which we simulate them. And from a policy perspective, there are some solutions that are not very effective individually. We want to put them together into a set. Renewables plus electrification plus energy efficiency plus taking action on oil together. That is a much more 2 + 2 = 5, basically, in that scenario, right? All right, so carbon pricing. Right now, so carbon pricing exists in about 25% of the world economy is covered by some form of carbon pricing mechanism. In the US, there isn't a federal carbon price. There are some regimes and schemes like RGGI on the East Coast. In California, where I'm based, we have cap and invest. So the government gives certain allowances to businesses, to the largest polluters. And if they exceed those allowances, they need to go out onto the public market and then buy those allowances. So 25% of the world economy is covered by some form of carbon pricing mechanism at $20. That's the average. So multiply that, 25 by 20 is $5. So this is how much we're taxing each ton of pollution. Some of you may be familiar with the concept of social cost of carbon. Okay, so that's how much each ton of carbon costs us. I'd like you to, for a second, make a prediction. How much each ton of pollution out there in the atmosphere costs you and me for taxpayer dollars and all the efforts we have to expand in dealing with the fallout of different extreme weather events and helping our community. So there's the financial cost, but there's also a more emotional cost. The model shows us that each ton of pollution costs us $5,458. That is cleanup costs, public health, loss of biodiversity, unavailability of insurance, all in. And we're taxing it at $5. So you don't need to know anything about climate policy to know there's a big, big, big disconnect. And the closer we can bring those two numbers together, I'm not prescribing policy, but you can see the challenge that we face, right? We're just not internalizing those external costs. And right now, it's the communities and primarily low-income communities that are essentially paying for these externalities, these external costs. Okay, where was I? Let's go back to this. So carbon pricing, $5. It needs to be a lot higher. So let's be realistic. We've been at $5 for a very, very long time. We're not all of a sudden going to be at 100 because politically it's very challenging. So let's say we can get to about $50 and this and it takes 10 years to achieve that. So let's see. So another point, if we were to go all the way 2 degrees, right, which is one of the closer to the goals of the Paris Agreement at this point. Now, it's the most effective climate solution in En-ROADS, carbon pricing. What is the challenge with that, though? And by the way, air pollution improves dramatically, really quickly. One of the interesting things to look out for in En-ROADS is when the two lines diverge. So your baseline and then your current scenario. So the baseline is this black line, and then current scenario is the blue line. Air pollution cleans up really, really fast. We saw that during COVID, didn't we? When we took cars off the road and the number of flights was reduced, air pollution cleaned up really fast. The challenge, however, with carbon pricing, which is why we're still at $5 and have been for a while, is that it results in price of metals. It's like energy prices spike almost immediately because we know that the fossil fuel resellers and utilities pass this cost onto consumers. So there needs to be some form of a redistribution or compensation mechanism to compensate ratepayers for higher cost of energy. And in California, we actually get a rebate twice a year on our bills to compensate us. So, all right, I appreciate this was a lot of information. We went through it really, really, really fast. So what we can do is we can go back to Spain and here. So this line, this is our baseline. So this is another 3.3 degrees of warming. But some parts of the country looking at up to 6 months of extreme heat. As you can see, we can improve that materially, okay? There's a big difference between 30 days and 90 days, particularly when vulnerable segments of the population are concerned. What about biodiversity loss? Let's take a look at my favorite graph. Again, a massive, massive improvement. So more than half the number of insect species or plant species or mammals, huge improvement actually, from almost a quarter of species to about 10%. So you can see noticeably, so it's not just about the temperature. That is the reason why we have the Paris Agreement. And some people may think of them as arbitrary numbers, 1.5 degrees of warming, 2 degrees of warming. Now you can see how much better we can do. Deaths from extreme heat bend the curve. Otherwise it's exponential curve. So we can do so much better on a range of different metrics. Outdoor labor losses, another really, really important financial metric for businesses. If it's too hot to work outside, it's not just loss of labor productivity, it's also loss of tax revenue, it's business confidence, it's a number of other knock-on impacts. So, as you can see, we can actually still get to the goals of the Paris Agreement just with the solutions that we have. They're available, that are scaled. I didn't touch fusion, I didn't touch CCS, I didn't touch green hydrogen, I didn't touch all sorts of marine CDR, solar engineering. We didn't do any of that. Bioenergy, and we got to 2 degrees. So it's still possible, at least physically. Whether it's possible politically is another question. All right. So this is my last poll for you. What are your biggest? So I've shared my biggest insights or takeaways from En-ROADS, but I obviously didn't mention everything. What are your biggest takeaways? And then we have let's give you a couple of minutes, and then we have a couple of minutes for questions. All right, so this is a free-flowing answer, so you don't need to hyphenate. You should be able to just respond to it. Oh, sorry, I've just deactivated it at some point. There you go. So what are your biggest takeaways from what you've just seen? Carbon pricing, yes. Yeah, yep. Very important, but very challenging. Thank you. Yes. Trade-offs, indeed. Limited capital. And we're seeing it right now, actually. We do a lot of work with pension funds, and some of them have a dedicated pot of money for climate solutions. And the question is, what is a climate solution? What's going to give you the biggest bang for your investment buck? And the more money you allocate to one type of technology, the less is available for other types of solutions. There's no silver bullet. Yes, indeed. We can persuade. Yes. Systems approach. Yes. Systems thinking. You're absolutely right. Where we add value is helping decision makers understand it's not just like a problem solution. It's not that simple. We have feedback loops, time delays, trade-offs, all these big systemic issues, multifaceted efforts, magic of energy. Thank you. Thank you. It's great data support on the policies. Fantastic. What it matters. Multi-stakeholder. Yes, it's the whole of society approach. In a way, this is really validating, because if you want to work in a field that touches on renewable energy, go and do that. If you want to work in sustainable agriculture, go and do that. If you're interested in advocating for carbon pricing, go and do that. It'll take many seeds to plant this garden. Some solutions are more impactful than others. But what is interesting is we can't get to those goals just on the supply side or demand side, or just with agriculture, or just with energy. It actually requires a bit of everything. But we have all the solutions that we need to get us to at least 2 degrees. All right, right, fantastic. Thank you very much. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and then we can open for questions. One other thing I was going to share with you in the chat is, if you're interested in learning more about En-ROADS and even potentially learning how to use this model, we have training available. It's a free training platform. It's called Mastering En-ROADS. It's self-paced. It's freely available, and it's about 20 to 30 hours of learning. You're very welcome to sign up to participate. All right.
Thank you so much, Katherine. We have, as you would expect, a lot of questions about the details. So some of those we will have to defer to everyone to play with the model on their own and explore. But one, I will kind of lump a couple of these together. One is, does the model account for both climate feedback loops like melting Arctic ice, as well as the possibilities of outlier events like Super El Nino?
Great question. So we don't currently, so feedback loops, yes, generally in terms of the carbon cycle. What I think you were referring to over there, whoever asked the question, thank you, is tipping points. We do not have tipping points in the model. El Nino, as you know, it's a seasonal effect. Yes, it does. It will be more extreme this year because of the climate crisis, but it does exist, and it's something we see every few years. We don't have tipping points in the model because it's extremely difficult to simulate, to model. There's very little evidence. If we think about AMOC, there's a lot of discussion right now around the circulation of the currents, right? We don't have tipping points around AMOC, perhaps, because we don't have the evidence. It's never happened before. So from the modeling perspective, we just wouldn't be comfortable. There would be a very low level of confidence around that. So yes, what is known as part of the carbon cycle, it is baked into the model. Tipping points, of which there are a few being discussed, particularly, as I said, around AMOC. We don't have that on the model. So thank you for the question.
I am going to, there are a lot of other great questions, but in the interest of time, I'm going to wrap us up, and I'm going to suggest that students who have more questions, first of all, there's a possibility that En-ROADS is offered at your school in one of your electives. There's a possibility that if it's not, that you could suggest to your faculty to bring it in as a workshop, or that you could become an En-ROADS climate ambassador yourself. So I'm going to encourage everyone. Hopefully this has given you some inspiration as well as a tangible tool to use, and that there's a lot more to come. I always find it fascinating to see the different ways that you can model the outputs and the impacts. And I love the connection not only just to our temperature rise, but also things like biodiversity and our quality of life and our air quality. There's so many different impacts in there built in. So hopefully you all have a chance to explore and use it more. And this is just the beginning of your experience with En-ROADS. We are next, our last session of our Climate Catalyst is a networking opportunity. So it's called Climate Connect. We will have more of these throughout the academic year, but we are really hoping that you will join for this one, even if you haven't attended any of the other previous Climate Catalyst sessions. This is a chance for you to connect with students who share some of your career interests. So as you all hopefully have gathered from our career conversations, the very best thing that you can be doing is talking to as many people as possible. Start your professional networking now. Meet some students from other schools who share some of your interests in industry topics. Compare notes, ask their opinions about the En-ROADS simulation, or ask their opinions about who they've been finding inspiring resources. We hope that you'll have a good discussion there, and we hope that you've had a great experience in our Climate Catalyst program so far. So many thanks again to Katherine for this really thought-provoking session, and thanks to all of you for being here today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.